A história da tradução no Brasil. The history of translation in Brazil through the centuries, in search of a tradition. Denis Silva Reis and John Milton. Universidade de Brasília, Universidade de São Paulo. This report attempts to give an overview of the history of translation and interpretation in Brazil from the 16th century to the present. It seeks to show important historical characters, works, and processes in translation studies in Portuguese America in order to discover a possible Brazilian translation tradition. The main paradigm of the history of Brazilian translation are also found in the historical events that took place during each century. In brief, the essay is a panoramic and critical view for non-specialists of the history of the Brazilian tradition of interpretation and translation. Introduction. What is the history of translation? To paraphrase the historian Mark Bloch, the translation of history is the study of the act of translation in time, which is made up of three levels: the translation agent, the translated works, and the act of translating, analyzed and shown diachronically. The history of translation in Brazil can be divided into two main areas: the history of oral translation, or interpreting, and written translation history. In this article, we divide the history of translation in Brazil into centuries. This division does not mean that writing the history of translation in Brazil has been chronological, or that its evolution and way of thinking has developed in a linear fashion, as many of the events in one period are repeated in another, in addition to the various perspectives which have been reinvented from earlier times. The process of translation in Brazil has been much more empirical than theoretical or functional, differently to Germany, for example, which explains the main types of translation mentioned, and the lack of writing on translation. Thus, this chapter attempts to show this empirical and practical tradition. The 16th century, the time of the línguas, the tongues, the Jesuits, and José de Anchieta. Translation, reduction. On arriving in Brazil in 1500 and encountering the native Indians, the Portuguese needed to make linguistic contact that in most cases was associated with the use of images and gestures in order to communicate. In the mid-16th century, trading depots where the goods from the colony were stored before shipping to Portugal were established. The accumulation of these goods, mostly carried out by barter, was to some extent possible thanks to the lingua, a kind of interpreter who spoke indigenous languages and who had been forced to learn the Indian language. Most linguas had been banished or shipwrecked, or were Portuguese criminals who had been released in Indian areas in order to learn the language and then serve as interpreters for the Portuguese colonial authorities. The figure of the lingua was also important as an agent of collaboration during the wars in the 16th century between the Portuguese and the Indians, and also between the Portuguese and pirates, privateers, and other colonizers, especially the French, Dutch, and Spanish, who tried to invade Brazil. Indians were kidnapped and taken to European countries to learn the language and customs of the colonizer and help to conquer the territories of the New World. This was a common practice at the time, and such Indians were called filiados, in contrast to the lançados, those who were left in foreign lands to learn the language of the Indians and then rescued in order to help with colonization. One of the major aims of colonization in Brazil was to take the Christian God to non-Christians, as the Indians were pagans and did not speak the language of the colonizer. Interpreting and translation were important instruments of catechesis and hence of civilization, following the lines of Catholic ideology. Many were Jesuits, Franciscans, Benedictines, and Mercedarians who settled in Brazil and learned the Tupi language in order to translate biblical teachings to the Indians in the form of songs and drama. The Jesuit João Aspicueta Navarro is considered the first translator in Brazil, with the publication of the Suma da Doutrina Cristã na Língua Tupi, Summa of Christian Doctrine in the Tupi language, in addition to translating in the 1550s prayers and sermons for catechetical work in Bahia. In São Paulo, the Jesuit priest José de Anchieta wrote a number of plays, many of which were modeled on those of the Portuguese playwright Gil Vicente. Anchieta, in addition to being the most important translator of this period, is also the first self-translator, as he translated the plays that he himself wrote. It should be noted that the translation practice of Anchieta created the first paradigm in the history of Brazilian translation. Translation reduction, a process of cultural translation that Anchieta invented in order to obtain equivalent and corresponding terms in Tupi of Catholic religious symbols that did not exist in the indigenous world, such as the devil, God, sin, heaven, hell, confession, and communion. In this process, ideas or words from one language were not translated exactly into another, since the cultures were very different, but a degree of meaning of the Christian message was attempted so that it could reach the indigenous people in their mother tongue. The contact of the linguas was so great in the 16th century period that the Jesuits founded schools to teach Portuguese to the Indians. Tupi, the Indian lingua franca, which was spoken just far along the Brazilian coast, to the Portuguese, and Latin to both, with the result that they produced the first Tupi grammar and established the so-called Língua Geral, general language, or Língua Brasílica, which was based on Tupi. Thus, Brazil, in this period, is a bilingual country. The teaching of Latin represented the knowledge of religious rites brought to Brazil by the evangelizing missions as well as the manufacture, sometimes in translation, of the few documents and official books that circulated in the colony at this time, among which were the booklets of Catholic prayers that were mostly bilingual, Latin, Portuguese. Although many translations were produced in the 16th century, many of them were only made for theatrical performance and are not extant. Translations did not circulate orally, but rather through the person of the lingua or in the presentations of religious theatre. This period represents the first moment of oral literature in Brazil, especially that inherited from the Indians, which was somehow translated and often adapted by the Portuguese inhabitants of Brazil. The 17th century, military translation, religious libraries, the importance of the linguas, Jewish interpreters, translation, appropriation. The 17th century saw an increase in multilingualism as, in addition to the territories occupied by the Portuguese along the Brazilian coast, the French occupied the present-day city of São Luís do Maranhão and the surrounding coastal areas, and the Dutch occupied what is now the state of Pernambuco. This resulted in even greater needs for linguists and the need for interpreters to help to maintain the lands the French and the Dutch had conquered. It was also in this period that black slaves from Africa who did not speak Portuguese were first brought to Brazil. Consequently, the number of languages spoken in Brazil multiplied, as did the need to communicate through interpreters of these different linguistic groups. Portugal's concern about losing land to the French, Spanish, and Dutch was so great that much greater attention was now given to artillery and the fortifications of the colony, with the result that Lisbon attempted to train native experts in these two areas. This was followed by courses in fortifications and military architecture in Bahia, Rio de Janeiro, Recife, and São Luís. With a wealth of Italian books on architecture translated into Portuguese in Lisbon, and which circulated in Brazil to spread knowledge of military architecture, for example, o Tratado de Vitruvio, the Treaty of Vitruvius. There is no knowledge of the translator, but it is known that the work was a translation. There were very few actual readers in the 17th century, and even the most wealthy sugar planters were illiterate. However, this was a period of the creation of a number of libraries maintained by religious orders which contained a large number of books in Latin. These were mostly religious, but there were also Greek classics translated into Latin and works in other languages that had escaped censorship and reached these libraries. In addition, the important role of religious orders, especially the Jesuits, can be seen in the translations they made for the small reading public, as well as in the production of the first dictionaries, glossaries, and grammars of languages spoken in the colony, which circulated among the religious institutions for both the teaching of reading and writing to the settlers and their evangelization. We can also highlight two other 17th century figures, Carneiro and Gregório de Matos. Carneiro was probably born in Cabo Frio in the state of Rio de Janeiro in 1618 and was a writer and chronicler general of Brazil. However, he became known for his translations from Italian and Spanish. Gregório de Matos was born in Bahia in 1636 and is most representative figure of the Brazilian Baroque. He is little known as a translator, though he translated Spanish and Italian poets such as Góngora, Quevedo, and Petrarch. Indeed, Gregório de Matos opens up another paradigm, that of translation appropriation, incorporating whole lines of other poets into his own poems. Some say he dialogued with other poets, while others considered his work as a plagiary, but both are able to identify the verbatim translations. In short, Gregório de Matos used imitation as the basis of his poems, as he believed this was one of the processes that would help him write perfect Baroque poetry. Matos may have translated some of his own poems into Spanish, which also makes him a self-translator. The 17th century also saw major expeditions into the hinterland by the entradas and the bandeiras. The entradas, financed by the Portuguese crown, intended to expand Portuguese territory, and the bandeiras were a private initiative by wealthy backers to make a profit from enslaving Indians and extracting minerals. Such expeditions used as their main agents the linguists, most of whom were Indians and who would know the territories to be explored. However, from the mid-century onwards, there were also European linguists who, in time, became sertanistas, a kind of police responsible for intermediating with the new peoples discovered in the hinterland. Indeed, most of the bandeirantes had a Portuguese father and Indian mother and spoke their mother tongue, so that translators were no longer necessary, which was a different situation to that of the entradas. One of the most famous interpreters of this time was Manuel de Souza de Eca, one of the major linguists of the period and an important pioneer and combatant in the territories of Ceará, Paraíba, Maranhão, Belém, and Amazonas. The destruction of the Quilombo de Palmares, the settlement of fugitive slaves, was the result of the Bandeirante Domingos Jorge Velho, who, in order to organize the attack on the Quilombo, took with him linguas as he felt more at ease in Tupi than in Portuguese. According to Câmara Cascudo, the 17th century was the first period of the sedimentation of Brazilian oral literature, where the mixture of Dutch, French, African, Spanish, and Portuguese customs, folklore, and stories formed the beginnings of an oral tradition among the inhabitants of the colony. For example, in the lullabies, the intrudo games, which gave rise to the Brazilian carnival, legends, and fables. There was also a very large influx of Jewish translators brought by Dutch settlers. The Jews who came to Pernambuco, New Holland, were attracted by free transport, free land, religious tolerance, and freedom of worship. Many of the Jews who went to Brazil became interpreters and, to a lesser extent, translators in Dutch, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. The Dutch, who were Protestants, preferred Jews to the Jesuits for this function, since they considered Jesuits to be traitors of the Dutch mission in the new colony. 18th century, translation and sedition, the ban on printing, Nogueira da Gama, the expulsion of the Jesuits, translation revolution. The 18th century can be defined by the settlement of much of the hinterland, a number of rebellions in various parts of the country, as well as the establishment of the concept of Brazilianness. In addition, wealth, work, and power were transferred from sugar to gold, from the northeast to the central regions of the colony. Brazilian Portuguese began to become unified, and the multilingualism of the previous century began to disappear, on one hand, through legislation or prohibitions, and on the other, through extermination or the expulsion of speakers of languages other than Portuguese. The Bandeirante pioneers discovered gold in the regions of Mato Grosso, Goiás, and Minas Gerais. As a result, new towns and cities were founded, resulting in a great cultural development in which translations had a definite place. Drama and opera groups visited the towns of Ouro Preto, São João del Rei, Cuiabá, and Goiás. In Goiás, for example, a number of Italian, Spanish, and French operas and plays which had been translated in Portugal were presented to the local public. The cultural production of the cities rich in gold was called Acadianism, and most of the intellectual Acadians had studied in Portugal and had libraries, a rarity in colonial Brazil. According to Irene Reis, these libraries were filled with translations into Portuguese or French of both literary works and illuminist works, many of which were banned by the Portuguese crown because of their radical ideas. Many of the Acadians were also translators. For example, Cláudio Manuel da Costa, who translated the works of Pietro Metastasio and works considered seditious such as The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. The collections of these libraries also included encyclopedias, dictionaries, and general reference books. Among the balanced books found in the Acadians' libraries were a number which introduced revolutionary ideas, especially those of the French Enlightenment, and any work in favor of the independence of the colony was suppressed by the authorities in Lisbon. This century also saw cases of pseudo-translations, of which the best known is the Cartas Chilenas, Chilean letters by Tomás Antonio Gonzaga. According to the introduction to the translation, the Cartas Chilenas were written by the Chilean poet Critilo, and their translation was supposed to be anonymous. And in fact, this translation is actually a satirical text by Tomás Gonzaga, which heavily criticizes the Portuguese governor Luís Cunha Menezes in Minas Gerais. Here we have a case of pseudo-translation where the source text does not exist, and it is worth remembering that the use of pseudonyms or anonymity of the texts in the 18th century was frequent, since the idea of authorship as we know it today did not yet exist. Prohibitions on settlers in many different aspects of life was also characteristic of the century in Brazil. The ban on native Brazilians being employed in the highest positions in the colony, heavy taxation, together with the ideas on enlightenment that circulated in Brazil through direct and indirect translations, led a number of potential rebellions and resistance movements against the Portuguese authorities, such as the Guerra dos Mascates de Minas in Recife, 1710 and 11, the Minas Conspiracy in 1789, and the Conjuração Baiana, Bahia Conspiracy, or the Revolta dos Alfaiates, Rebellion of the Tailors in 1798. Knowledge and information, particularly of revolutionary ideas coming from France and North America, were considered a menace, and the production, printing, and distribution of books were prohibited. Hence, the censorship, the large number of smuggled books, and the anonymous translations made in Brazil and in Portugal and distributed illegally. Carlos Villalta states that translators not only translated foreign texts into the vernacular, but also adapted them by modifying them significantly, frequently making them more subversive. One of the most famous revolutionary translators of this period was Francisco Muniz Barreto de Aragão, a Latin teacher in Bahia and the promoter of seditious ideas. A large number of manuscripts of translations of books, such as O Orador dos Estados Gerais de 1789, L'Orateur d'États Généraux pour 1789, by Jean-Louis Carre, Fala, by Boissy d'Anglais, and The Aviso de Petersburgo, anonymous, were found in his library, and these were considered the works that guided the rebellion of the tailors. Although his translations were not printed, they were recopied by hand and read orally in meetings to disseminate the latest revolutionary ideas coming out of Europe. According to José Silva and Soraya Adorno, Muniz Barreto is largely responsible for, through the translation and sharing of texts considered revolutionary, captivating the young conspirators from Bahia with the ideology coming from France. The most active Brazilian translator in this period is Manuel Jacinto Nogueira da Gama from São João del Rei in the state of Minas Gerais. He was an army officer who studied at the University of Coimbra, and most of his translations were linked to his teaching at the Royal Navy Academy and published in Portugal. However, what is interesting are the introductory paratexts to his translations. For example, in the translator's discourse to his translation of Reflexões sobre a Metafísica do Cálculo Infinitesimal, Reflections on the Metaphysics of the Infinitesimal Calculus, Nogueira da Gama justifies the use of translation as a tool of the dissemination of scientific knowledge, the only solution for difficulties created by the use of lingua francas in contexts of linguistic diversity and as a means to democratize knowledge. During this period, most of the Brazilian intellectual elite had studied in Coimbra, and on their return to Brazil, they felt the need to read, write, and discuss art, literature, music, science, and history. Thus, the creation of literary clubs or academies where the revolutionary texts were read, discussed, and sometimes translated. In Portugal, scholarly societies were also established, and in the Royal Academy of Sciences of Lisbon, which was supported by the state, Portuguese and Brazilian intellectuals discussed the most diverse issues relating to fine arts and sciences. Among the texts of these Brazilians, we can find various translations of an Enlightenment and scientific background that circulated among a select group of men both in Portugal and in Brazil, and thanks to this group, 18th century Brazil had access to the little available knowledge in the science and humanities, since the purpose of the Royal Academy of Sciences of Lisbon was to promote studies to better use the vast patrimony of the Portuguese crown and strengthen the Luso-Brazilian Empire. The craft of the interpreter was also highly valued in the 18th century, among other reasons because of the phenomenon of tropeirismo, transporting cattle with teams of horses or packs of mules across vast distances to reach the site of the mines, and interpreters were used to communicate with unknown peoples from the central areas of Brazil. They were also as a communication link with the numerous European travelers who came to study Brazilian natural phenomena. Similarly, the movement of the Monções river expeditions that left São Paulo for Mato Grosso at the time of the monsoons in order to supply the gold mines, and the demand for drugs and natural medicines from the sertão, the dry backlands, also required interpreters. The Monções used as interpreters the Brazilian Mameluques, who were a mixture of whites and Indians, and Cafuzos, a mixture of Negroes and Indians, and the expeditions to the sertão used the Indians. Such pioneering expeditions were very important for the settlement and enrichment of these hitherto virgin lands. The region of the Sete Povos das Missões Orientais, now the state of the Rio Grande do Sul, was also opened up and attached to Brazil in the 18th century. In this area, the Guarani Indians could read and write in Spanish, Latin, and Portuguese, a very unusual phenomenon at the time. Such a feat was the result of the Jesuit missions that were using the translation of Spanish and Portuguese books to Guarani as an instrument of evangelization, as well as an ideological weapon of Spanish and Portuguese anti-colonialism. The translation into Guarani of Conquista Espiritual, Spiritual Conquest, by Antônio Ruiz de Montoya, later translated into Portuguese by the Brazilian Batista Caetano de Almeida Nogueira, comes from this time. In 1759, the Jesuits were expelled from Brazil by the Marquis of Pombal, the Portuguese prime minister, who made a number of administrative reforms in Portugal, which also applied to the colonies. One of them was the reform of education, which moved the responsibility of teaching away from the church to the state. For the first time in Brazil, there were non-religious schools with classes under the responsibility of the crown, with teaching initially of Latin grammar, rhetoric, and Greek, and later reading, writing, calculus, and philosophy. This resulted in the circulation of the first textbooks in Brazil, which were often translated into Portugal and then used by teachers in the colony. There are maths books entitled Elementos de Euclides, Elements by Euclid, translated by João Ângelo Brunelli, and Compendium by Is Bizot, translated by José Monteiro da Rocha. Both books were used in the Crown schools to teach calculus both in Portugal and Brazil. The Marquis of Pombal published a document called Diretório dos Índios, Directory of Indians, which prohibited, under the penalty of death, the teaching in any language other than Portuguese. This contributed to the disappearance of the general language, whose basis was Tupi. With regard to oral literature, the 18th century was the period of the consolidation of two literary genres linked to Brazilian folklore, the cordel, literary string literature, and the folheto, pamphlet literature. According to Márcia Abreu, during the 18th century, there was an immense amount of cordel literature and pamphlets translated from Spanish and French and sent from Portugal to the cities in the states of Rio de Janeiro, Bahia, Pernambuco, Maranhão, and Pará. Such translated literature was very important as it gave rise to and served as a model for the production of such genres in Brazil. These texts, read both in the colony and in Portugal, were popular texts read by the lower social strata. Having a wide distribution, they were more cost-effective and were less censored, as they did not usually deal with subversive subjects, but rather with moralistic, apologetic, legendary, and fantastic themes. In short, the paradigm of translation history in the 18th century in Brazil is that of translation revolution, where knowledge was spread illegally through translations, and whose results were reflected both in terms of thinking and concepts of nationality, leading to the development of new types of knowledge in many fields and the instigation of a number of rebellions, wars, and battles. The 19th century, the translation of scientific works, plagiarism, literary, religious, and children's books, the institutionalism of translation. The 19th century was the century of great political, social, and economic changes represented by three different governments in Brazil. The colonial government from 1801 to 1821, the empire from 1822 to 1888, and the republic beginning in 1889. The arrival of the Portuguese royal family in 1808 also brought the end of the prohibition of publication and printing of books, as well as the institutionalization of the figure of the interpreter. Thanks to the royal family, the European custom books and periodicals became popular in Brazil, and this led to the creation of the royal press, the Imprensa Regia, the first official Brazilian printing press. This permitted the circulation of the texts of the colony and then the empire, both literary texts and translations. The French mission, which also popularized the habit of reading books, either in French or translated into Portuguese, established the first-degree courses in Brazil in specialized schools of engineering, medicine, law, and agriculture. The end of censorship resulted in the appearance of a large number of printing houses throughout Brazil that published well-known sentimental, moralistic novels with tempting titles in order to induce readers to purchase them. One of the best known is that of Baptiste Louis Garnier, who had a very well-organized literary translation program. Garnier, a Frenchman who lived in Rio de Janeiro, hired translators to translate French works, had them printed in France, and then they were brought in just 21 days by steamboat to be sold in Brazil. In the area of technical and scientific translations, the Arco do Cego typography in Lisbon had done something similar at the turn of the century. Friar Mariano da Conceição Veloso, together with other translators, had produced hundreds of translated books which had been sent to Brazil to inform and teach Brazilian farmers about new farming techniques. This also helped to make Portuguese the natural language to be used in science, replacing Latin. In fact, the language of the diffusion of technical and scientific material in Europe of the 19th century was mainly German. Books on medicine and military affairs were translated in Brazil from German from French translations of the German, frequently by doctors and army officers. For example, the military doctor from Bahia, Pirajá da Silva, the translator from German of the classic work of the naturalist von Martius, Das Naturell die Krankheiten, Nature, Illness, Medicine, and Remedies of the Brazilian Indians. This period saw the first specialized scientific libraries and the translation, adaptation of textbooks. In this pre-international copyright period, the translator was considered, according to the law, the author of the text in Portuguese. The translation of subversive books, a characteristic of the 18th century, continued into the 19th century, and in addition to books, this kind of translation could also be found in newspapers and journal O Progresso, social, literária e científica, Progress, social, literary, and scientific, founded by Antônio Pedro de Figueiredo, circulated in Brazil between 1846 and 1848, and was responsible for introducing voyeurism into Brazil. Plagiarism and pirate translations were rife in the 1800s in Brazil. There were two kinds of plagiarism: the translation of a text that had been plagiarized in Europe, and the translation which was adapted or given a Brazilian setting. According to Lúcia Palares Burke, the translation of Nísia Floresta Augusta Brasileira of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft was in reality no more than a plagiarism of a text entitled Woman Not Inferior to Man, attributed to Sophia, a person of quality, which shows that the text of Wollstonecraft was still unknown in Brasilia. Lúcia Palares Burke also states in her work on the newspaper O Carapuceiro that many of the articles in this newspaper from Pernambuco were translations of almost a century before, adapted to the Brazilian reality. They were translations which were presented as originals. With regard to pirate translations, copyright laws were introduced in the 19th century, but as the book trade was very profitable, particularly the trade of foreign works, there were many translations with amputated texts which had been reworked and adapted so that the editors did not have a duty to pay the copyright. The area of religion was another popular area of translation. In the 1800s, translations of Protestant texts were made in newspapers to spread the non-Catholic Christian faith. For example, the translation of O Peregrino, The Pilgrim's Progress, by John Bunyan, first serialized in a newspaper and then published in book format. Many novels were translated and published first in serial form and soon after in a book form, as was the case with L'Homme qui rit by Victor Hugo. Operas, vaudeville, shows that and tragedies were adapted or translated from French, Italian, Spanish, and German for the Brazilian public, and thus led to the opening of the dramatic conservatory to set norms for the language of translated plays. Children's literature and literature for a male audience was also made great advances in the 19th century. There were many children's books translated in Brazil, especially those of Pedro da Silva Quaresma from Rio de Janeiro, who, wishing to reach a wide audience, launched the Biblioteca Infantil Children's Library with translations of works by Charles Perrault, the Brothers Grimm, Andersen, etc. Erotic pornographic literature, known as books of sensations or literature for men, was very popular, with translations of works by authors such as John Cleland, Jean-Baptiste Boyer, Gervase de la Touche, Alexandre Dumas-Fils, Émile Zola, Gustave Flaubert, and Denis Diderot. Such translations, whether for children's works or erotic pornographic literature, encouraged Brazilian writers to produce epigonic works. Moreover, aspiring writers were often translators before starting their literary careers. In the 19th century, the profession of interpreting was institutionalized by a number of decrees in various parts of Brazil and covered a large number of professions: businessman, diplomat, soldier, legal and medical assistant, tour guide, and a missionary. they were also the main links with linguistic communities of other nations and local Portuguese authorities. Interpreters also helped to settle the various immigrant communities such as the Belgian, German, English, Russian, Japanese, Italian, Spanish, Austrian, French, and Syrians and Arabs from the Ottoman Empire, especially during the coffee cycle in São Paulo state, and in the southern states of Paraná, Santa Catarina, and Rio Grande do Sul, as well as in the boom in the rubber growing areas in Amazonia. Both the Indian and the Mameluque linguas continued to be required, especially in the north of Brazil and the border regions. We also find the emergency of the professional sworn translator, who was often an army officer and who also made written translations of official documents. After being a translator, Liberato Mitchell, an English immigrant who lived in Maceió, became a clerk and politician. Many immigrants who knew a number of languages lived by interpreting until they found another profession. This is the case of Jews who arrived in the Republic in the late 19th century. Here we can mention the dragomans, interpreters of non-Western languages, who usually worked as diplomatic agents and were important figures in the development of international relations. In the 19th century, we also find, for the first time in the history of translation in Brazil, a method for teaching interpretation. O Selvagem, by Couto de Magalhães, addressed Brazilian military interpreters to help surveillance and the taming of the Indians who had not yet been civilized and who could not read or write in Portuguese. In addition, the Santa Isabel College, founded in 1870 in northern Goiás, now Tocantins state, was the first educational institution to teach oral translation. This college was intended to train the Indians captured in the Tocantins region to be interpreters in order to help in the colonization of the Midwest region of Brazil. However, the school lasted a very short time due to the high dropout rate. Many of those who did become Indian interpreters could speak Portuguese, but few could write. And there were few Indians who, knowing Portuguese, the language of the colonizer, contributed to the civilizing project of Santa Isabel College and Magalhães Couto's work. In the areas of interpretation and translation, the 1800s were a period of great production and dissemination of knowledge, institutionalized either by the government or by other institutions of these two professions, which greatly contributed to the economic, cultural, social, and political development of Brazil. The 20th and 21st centuries, Monteiro Lobato, translations from English, the golden age of translation, translation as a profession, media translation, translation studies, translation inclusion. The 20th and the beginning of the 21st centuries in Brazil have seen an enormous increase in translation and interpreting to a great extent as a result of the changes Brazil went through from being an agricultural country greatly dependent on the export of coffee to a major industrial country and exporter of industrial goods. Changes in government from the Republic to the dictatorship of Getúlio Vargas in 1930 with its nationalistic bent, then the restoration of democracy followed by the US-backed military coup of 1964 with democracy only re-emerging in 1989 have played a major role in influencing the translation market. And the 20th century cannot be mentioned without a consideration of the two world wars. And although Brazil did not take part in World War I, World War I and only had a cameo role in World War II, the results of the World Wars were far-reaching in terms of all activities, including translation and interpreting, especially in furthering the domination of English and unifying Brazil into a monolingual unitary state with Portuguese spoken in every single municipality and the reduction of number of speaking Indian languages. In 1938, Vargas obliged all schools to teach in Portuguese. Foreign languages could not be taught to under 14s. Newspapers in foreign languages were closed down, and in 1939 it was forbidden to speak in a foreign language in public. These measures greatly reduced the use of German, Italian, Japanese, Yiddish, and other languages in the many immigrant colonies in southern and southeastern Brazil. Moreover, the fact that the Axis powers were defeated in the Second World War made immigrants from these countries see their future as being in Brazil. Few of the children of Japanese immigrants born in the years after the Second World War learned Japanese fluently. José Bento Monteiro Lobato is the major figure in the development of a national mass book market in Brazil. After working as a public prosecutor for a while in Areias, near Taubaté, São Paulo state, in 1918, in São Paulo, he founded the publishing company Monteiro Lobato e Companhia. And then, when this company went bankrupt in 1925, Companhia Editora Nacional. The dominance of Lobato's companies can be seen by the fact that by 1920, more than half of all the literary works published in Brazil were published by Monteiro Lobato e Companhia, and in 1941, in a much larger book market, a quarter of all books published were produced by Lobato's Companhia Editora Nacional. Opposing the dominant Francophile culture, most of the works he translated were from English. He translated, adapted Peter Pan, Alice in Wonderland, Robinson Crusoe, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and The Gulliver's Travels. And the Companhia Editora Nacional published works by Conan Doyle, Eleanor Porter, Hemingway, Wells, Melville, Jack London, Steinbeck, and Kipling. In total, Lobato translated 82 works to Portuguese. Despite his poor relationship with the Vargas government, in 1941, Lobato was imprisoned for 6 months, of which he served 3 by the Vargas regime for his constant critiques of the government. Lobato and the Vargas government can be seen as partners in the development of the book industry and the growth in the number of published translations. Considerably higher literacy rates resulted in a growth of the market of middle-class readers, most of whom were not familiar with foreign languages. The growth of cinema, particularly Hollywood films, resulted in demand for the translations of the original works of film adaptations. Novels continued to be published in serial form in newspapers justly upon newspapers up until this period, and we can also find translations in new genres such as film scripts and the beginning of the market of comics and photo stories in translation. During this period, we can find a number of important innovations in the book industry. Lobato's Editora Companhia Nacional, Editora José Olímpio, and Editora Globo de Porto Alegre published a number of collections of classic, contemporary, detective, and popular novels, children's works, essays, technical works, making available for the first time in Brazil the works of Dostoevsky, Bret Harte, Flaubert, O. Henry Poe, and Mark Twain, among many other authors. Editora Globo was particularly innovative, with high-quality translations, many of which were produced by recognized writers, full-time contracts for some of its translators, and a well-equipped office of translator's room. Indeed, Leah Weiler has described the period from 1942 to 1947 as the golden age of translation Brazil. After the downfall of Vargas in 1945, an artificially high exchange rate to please the exporters of coffee and other goods after the Second World War, books in a number of areas received preferential tariffs and in many cases were actually sold at a lower cost in Brazil than in their countries of origin. Through the 1950s, imported books were sold at a preferential dollar rate which ranged from 33% to 60% of the official dollar rate, with the result that it was cheaper to import books than the paper on which to print books. As translation rights had to be paid at the official dollar exchange rate, it was much cheaper to import a translation made in Portugal than to buy the rights and carry out the translation in Brazil. Obviously, this period slowed growth in the Brazilian publishing industry, particularly in the area of translations. Certain publishing houses specializing in works by or on left-wing figures such as Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Engels, and works on the Soviet Union or the Cuban Revolution, and also works on the recent history of Brazil, were severely hampered by the censorship of the military dictatorship, especially from the end of 1968 to 1976. From the 1940s to 60s, comics in Brazil were censored, often self-censored by the publishing companies themselves, as this genre, as in many other countries, was considered pernicious for the education of children, encouraging idleness and leading them along the path of violence and crime. However, during the military regime, the Brazilian book industry grew at a rate that was more rapid than the rest of the Brazilian economy and also led to a large increase in the amount of technical translation, and perhaps for the first time ever, translation became a viable full-time occupation for many, with the number of companies employing in-house translators. The U.S. government had supported the 1964 military coup, and we can clearly see U.S. soft power at work through the Snell USAID cooperation for publication of technical, scientific, and educational books, signed on January 1967, which resulted in a flood of American authors, particularly in technical areas. A total of 51 million translated copies of books which had originally been published in the U.S. to be used in the Brazilian school system were printed from 1967 to 1970, while MEC, the Ministry of Education and Culture, and SNEL, the Brazilian National Union of Book Publishers, set the policies. USAID, United States Agency for International Development, technicians organized the technical production details such as publishing, formatting, and illustrations, and distribution, as well as overseeing the acquisition of copyright. Needless to say, all of the works published were originally written in English. Publishers such as McGraw-Hill and Guanabara Coogan published works in areas such as business, economics, medicine, and engineering. Studying economics, engineering, marketing, etc., through the translation of an American textbook, the future Brazilian technical and administrative classes would follow the American way of thinking and the American way of life, and thus considerable influence has existed up until the present. However, influence from American translated works did not only reinforce conservative values and strengthen Yankee influence in Brazil. In societies where it is impossible to make very direct protest, it may be easier and more practical to import the protest of others through translation, and the dictatorship saw a number of translations of the works of the Beats. Media translation truly started in the 20th century, with the first film intertitles in 1901. As in the rest of the Western world, Hollywood movies were immensely popular in Brazil. The first film to be dubbed was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1938, and in 1946, Herbert Richards set up one of the first completely Brazilian studios, and in 1958, Gravação began to dub films from Columbia Pictures. On television, the first program to be dubbed was the American series The Ford Television Theater, also in 1958, and in 1962 the market was enlarged by a decree from President Jânio Quadros requiring all films in foreign languages to be dubbed. Since 1962, in Brazil, all foreign language programs on television have been dubbed, whereas in the cinema, subtitling is the norm. Television has been the entertainment for the poorer classes, and the literary and literacy rates have traditionally been low, while cinema-going is a more middle-class activity. However, as in the rest of the world, media translation is no longer limited to the films. This massive growth of cable channels appealing to a more middle-class audience, DVDs, and the use of the SAP secondary audio programming button enabling viewers to change language have resulted in the growth of subtitling, which is much cheaper than dubbing. A greater awareness of a sympathy for those with physical handicaps coupled with recent legislation has led to a large number of television programs receiving subtitles for the deaf or interpreting in Libras, Brazilian Sign Language. Museums also provide accessibility. Indeed, studies in Brazilian Sign Language are now part of postgraduate programs at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, and a number of universities include Libras courses in their curricula. In the area of professional interpreting, probably the first major international event in Brazil to use professional interpreters was the September 1947 meeting of the Organization of American States. In 1948, IBM supplied the equipment for the simultaneous interpreting for an international conference on health in Rio de Janeiro, and shortly afterwards, Edith von Boyck, a Brazilian of French origins, organized a group of interpreters which would dominate interpreting in Rio de Janeiro until the 1970s. In São Paulo, in 1971, a group of interpreters formed the first professional association of interpreters, the Paulista later Professional Association of Congress Interpreters, which has dominated the market through more recently a number of interpreting agencies offering cheaper rates than the $500 a day charged by APIC members have managed to encroach into what is a very small market. There are few institutions in Brazil to train interpreters, and they only work with the Portuguese-English language combination. Nevertheless, as throughout the world, there is a significant amount of informal interpreting made by hotel receptionists, the civil and federal police, pilots and airline staff, in business, and of course, in immigrant families. Translation studies has grown enormously in the last 30 years. However, there are certain peculiarities to the Brazilian situation. Comparative literature departments were not active in developing translation studies, and the non-academic publishings in the Folhetim, the cultural supplement of the São Paulo newspaper, the Folha de São Paulo, especially Augusto de Campos, his brother, Haroldo de Campos, José Paulo Paes, and Nelson Asher, played an important role in its origins, as did the Hungarian immigrant Paulo Ronay, prolific literary translator and author of the first work on translation in Brazil, A Escola de Tradutores. Towards the end of the 1980s, Brazilian universities began to take an interest in translation studies. Haroldo de Campos, who, like his brother Augusto, was by profession a lawyer and who worked in an administrative position at the University of São Paulo, was invited to work at the Catholic University of São Paulo in the Semiotics and Communication program. José Paulo Paes, originally an industrial chemist, organized a translation workshop at the University of Campinas in 1987 and then gave a course as visiting professor at USP from August to October 1987. In the late 1980s and 1990s at Unicamp, we can find what may be called the first translation studies school in Brazil. Rosemary Arrojo's work at Unicamp, linking deconstruction and translation, is widely known in the area, and she was supported by Paulo Ottoni, a specialist on Derrida. Working in the Applied Linguistics Department of the Institute of Language Studies, they were responsible for a large number of MA dissertation and PhD theses. Other universities later caught up, and the rapid growth and popularity of translation studies can be seen by the fact that there were more than 1,500 participants in the Brazilian National Translation Studies Forum at the Santa Catarina Federal University in 2013, whose MA in Translation Studies started in 2003 with the PhD beginning in 2008. There are now 68 MA students, 105 PhD students, 4 postdoctoral students, a total of 177 students. To date, 260 students have defended their MA dissertations and 110 their PhD theses. The worldwide popularity of translation studies, the fragmentation of comparative literature, the decreasing prestige of the traditional letras courses, which have had a non-professional orientation, and the relatively high profile of figures such as Campos Brothers are among the reasons for such growth. On the other hand, although degrees in translation and interpreting exist in some 25 Brazilian institutions, relatively few students end up working in the translation profession. All the courses are tied to traditional humanity courses with no or little contact with technical areas, and a broad general entrance exam means that students with a poor foreign language level may enter a specialized translation course. Thus, the course may become more of a foreign language teaching course. The universities do not keep records, but the survey of the Brazilian Translators Association, Abratis, showed that only 29% of professional translators had taken a BA in translation, while 38% had taken any kind of postgraduate course, including MAs, PhDs, and also one-off specialization and diploma courses. Erika Stupiello, teacher of translation at the State University of São Paulo, believes that between 30 and 40% of students graduate in the BA course work in the profession, and the tendency is to increase. The same survey showed that 78% of the 927 translators and interpreters used English as their main foreign language, with the Spanish and French a distant second and third. In which other areas can we foresee translation and interpreting developing in the 21st century? Community interpreting has yet to develop as a profession in Brazil. There is no institution which teaches courses in the area, and it has been the subject of only one thesis. Future development will depend on the Brazilian economy and global migrations. Brazil has welcomed a number of Haitian refugees, some 50,000 from 2010 to 2016, but few displaced Syrians or Iraqis have found their way to Brazil. The large number of Spanish-speaking immigrants, mainly from Bolivia and more recently from Venezuela, can be understood by Brazilians with little problem owing to the proximity between Spanish and Portuguese. Ad hoc solutions are also used in court interpreting, another area where no official training exists. Sworn translators or university language professors may be called on to offer their services, usually free of charge. The limited number of such cases has so far hindered the need for official professional training. It seems that the myth that anyone who knows a foreign language and has a certain level of education can act as an interpreter is still quite prevalent. With a growing acculturation and increasing contact with the towns and cities of most Brazilian Indian groups, the traditional profession of the lingua has virtually disappeared. Indeed, a large number of Brazilian Indians have now lost their original languages. However, an opposite trend may be beginning, with projects such as that of Professor Eduardo Navarro at the University of São Paulo, who, together with his research students and other researchers at the Federal University of São Carlos, helps to run a scheme in the district of São Gabriel da Cachoeira, state of Amazonas, to train teachers in Indian languages of Baniwa, Nhangatu, and Tucano, the official languages of the district, which is the only municipal district in Brazil which is officially multilingual. In addition to producing teaching material, Navarro's students translate literary works in Indian languages to be used as class reading material to help re-establish the Indian languages. Thus, at the beginning of the 21st century, it is impossible to identify a single dominant concept of translation in Brazil. The publishing, media, and technical markets are dominated by translations to and from English, with automatic translation increasingly used, usually being post-edited. The Campos Brothers' theories of recreation and transcreation have been followed more and more closely in the academic world, but surprisingly less so by Brazilian translators of poetry. As a result of the policy of Portugal in the 18th century in making Portuguese the only language used in education, and the dictator Getúlio Vargas in banning in schools from teaching in languages other than Portuguese, Brazil is surprisingly homogeneous linguistically, with Portuguese being the dominant language throughout the huge country. It may be said that in the 21st centuries, there has been much greater visibility of translation from the theoretical perspective, especially of European theories which have been spread in Brazil, and also in universities with the growth of undergraduate courses in translation. However, much remains to be done to improve teaching of translation in Brazilian universities and direct it towards the professional market. To a certain extent, this is being done with the teaching in areas which did not exist or which were marginalized in previous centuries, such as sign language, dubbing, localization, subtitling, audio description, and the study of propagation of Indian languages. And this helps to make the paradigm of translation in the 20th and 21st centuries that of translation inclusion. Final remarks. The history of translation in Brazil has shown the development of the professions of the translator and interpreter. The paradigms and the ways of thinking about translation also change. In the 16th century, translation can be seen as reduction in the attempt to translate the culture and language of the Indians. In the 17th century, translation is imitation or appropriation in order to reproduce what the time was in vogue. In the 18th century, translation was revolution, which called for action from those who had access to learning to spread their knowledge. In the 19th century, one sees the institutionalization of the profession in its first stages, often as a stepping stone to other forms of employment. This was consolidated in the 20th century with the creation of university courses and the theory of Brazilian translation. Already in the 21st century, we have the paradigm of translation inclusion, whereby other types of translation are both studied in the university and become part of the labor market. Translators and translations have played an important role in the history of Brazil, and we hope this chapter shows how the craft of incorporating the other has helped to make Brazil more developed, globalized, dynamic, with a miscegenation of cultures, peoples, and knowledge. Moreover, the tradition of translation in Brazil is still empirical and based on necessity. In other words, when there comes about a new context in which translation is required, new professions related to translation and or interpreting appear, and their institutionalization is a consequence of this increasingly professionalized need. The Brazilian tradition of translation is also based on experience and reflection, as has been seen in this chapter, and now translation studies is very firmly entrenched in the university. This is different from European countries where more abstract theories and approaches to translation have come not only from the university but also from the church, as in the case of Luther and Saint Jerome, liberal movements such as the French Revolution, the independence movement of the South American countries from Spain, and the Irish independence movement, which produced adapted translations and professional associations such as AIIC, the International Association of Conference Interpreters.